Chapter 6 Crisis of Commerce. Year 0001, December 17th. The dust kicked up by the trio's shoes dispersed slowly in the gloomy streets of the slums. Cloud, Zack, and Aerith had left the church soon after Zack and Viri's impromptu game of chase/keep away. Cloud had tucked the little chick securely under his arm again as they headed for Sector 6 and the vivacious wall market. Cloud breathed a silent sigh, trying to soothe the continued feeling of being too far out of his depth that was mixed with the pure joy of his two greatest regrets being alive and well. Before now, he hadn't taken into consideration the fact that in this time Aerith was still alive. Oh, he'd known it, on a subconscious level, but he hadn't acknowledged that fact until Zack had dropped his bombshell announcement on the train. Unable to prepare himself, he'd nearly given in to the black despair that had his feet itching to run the other way. But he couldn't disappoint Zack like that. Instead, Cloud had followed his friend reluctantly through the slum streets. An icy feeling of guilty anticipation had grown the closer they got to the church, and Cloud found himself both terrified and longing to see Aerith again. Would she know him? There was no way, of course, but somehow with Aerith it seemed possible. His worries had been unfounded, and Cloud remembered how his breath had caught in his throat at the first sight of her. She was wearing a white sundress, so unlike the more sturdy pink dress he'd met her in, and it had shone in the sparse sunlight of the church. Her welcome had been as warm as her smile, and it had been easy for Cloud to forget for a little bit the horror of the last time he'd seen her alive. Now that the reality of Aerith's presence, her living presence, had settled in, Cloud found it easy to just hang back and watch Zack and Aerith. It was a strange picture, with sections of broken concrete looming above them and shattered highway beneath their feet. Aerith with her head tilted up as she listened to Zack relate some animated tale. Her smile lit up her green eyes as she laughed. A lump formed in Cloud's throat at the sight. He wasn't sure who to thank, but just having the opportunity to see them together and happy was worth all the suffering he'd been through. He told himself later that he should have known such a light-hearted situation wouldn't last, that he should have been more prepared. But the truth was that Cloud had forgotten about the monster-infested streets of the slums. The remnants had called their shadow monsters, and then Bahamut, Sin, and that had been the first major case of monster attack on the city since Meteor, since the creation of Edge at the epicenter of where the life stream had converged. It had been rare for monsters to set foot in the city. Between Reeves' WRO and Rufus, they'd managed to set up safe areas around most of the more heavily populated areas. It was in between these cities that remained dangerous, as Cloud well knew from his travels for his delivery service. It happened as they crossed through the old park, eerily silent and barren. From all corners, violently red and purple spiked, a good dozen hedgehog pies came at them. Aerith gave a little gasp of surprise and jerked back a few steps. Cloud didn't even pause to consider how balefully weak they were. All he knew was that his friends were in danger, and he needed to protect them.
"Don't worry, we got this,"
Zack said, voice ringing out. He lunged forward immediately, buster sword in hand, and used the blunt edge to sweep several of the monsters back, before he used it again to bludgeon another in the stomach.
"Viri, stay,"
Cloud said, shoving the chick into Aerith's startled arms, even as he turned and drew the sword on his back. He was thrown for a moment at the unusual balance, so unlike first Tsurugi, before old habits kicked in and he laid into the nearest monster with vehemence. The hedgehog pie didn't even have time to squeal before it was carved in two, another being caught on the follow-through the swing he sent tumbling across the park. Cloud was aware of Zack fighting nearby, and could feel the hum as a spell was cast. It made him painfully aware of his own under-equipped stock, despite the fact that these monsters were hardly worth the effort of wasted energy. He saw Zack bat another of the creatures with the flat of his blade out of the corner of his eye, before finishing it with a well-placed ice spell. Cloud was baffled at that. Why didn't Zack just use his sword? One monster tried to slip past Cloud's feet. He turned and took out some of his frustration as he kicked the creature as hard as he could. It made a satisfying crunch as it flew out of view. He looked up to see Aerith standing pale and frightened, her hands clasped to her chest as she craned her head wearily around. Veery was at her feet, though how the bird had gotten loose from her Cloud didn't know, and had its wings extended, head down as he hissed angrily. He didn't move from Aerith's side, but kept snapping at the air in the direction of the monsters. It only took another minute or so for Cloud and Zack to finish off the small herd, and soon silence fell again on the playground. Cloud turned, one hand delving into a pocket to pull out a cloth and wipe his blade clean. Dismissing the encounter, he went back to collect his agitated charge. Aerith still looked pale. It surprised Cloud to see her trembling a little. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, thrown as he realized this Aerith had never once fought a monster before. Cloud had been able to forget, for a while, when he talked with her about parts of the sum he knew, careful not to be too specific, lest his future knowledge prove to be false now. Before Aerith could answer, Cloud heard Zack's footsteps approaching, and he turned towards his friend, face blank, as he tried to figure out how he should act now. Had he made a mistake? Zack hadn't wanted Aerith to be involved. But what did he consider involvement? Zack gave Cloud 2 thumbs up.
Nice job, Cloud. Good to know you've got my back.
Then he turned to Aerith and winked at her.
See? No problem. I said I'd protect you, right? And Cloud's here too. These guys are nothing for a soldier and...
He looked at Cloud with a crooked grin.
What are you now, anyway? Soldier light? An Ultima trooper? I can't decide what we're supposed to refer to you as.
I don't see how I can feel unsafe with you two and Veery protecting me, Aerith said, her voice wavering just slightly.
Exactly,
Zack said cheerfully, and slung an arm around Cloud's neck to pull him into a loose headlock.
Cloud's not a soldier, but he's still really handy to have around. In fact, I bet he's almost as cool as I am. Fuzzy is just an additional security.
Zack's ability to turn a tense situation into almost absurdity was miraculous, Cloud decided. He didn't appreciate the headlock. It sent a brief pang of sadness to his heart as he remembered a time when Sid would do the same, when Cloud was being particularly gloomy, or the pilot was in an agitated mood over his precious airship. But he forgave Zack the indignity when it caused Aerith to relax. Aerith laughed in earnest as she watched them, then reached over to shove at Zack's shoulder.
Let him go, silly. You're going to suffocate him. He's made of tougher stuff than that, aren't you, Cloud?
Zack asked, and ruffled Cloud's wild hair. Cloud could only scowl and shove at his side.
Nobody else I trust to have at my back.
Once he was released from Zack's grip, Cloud knelt down to inspect Veery. He carefully checked the chick over to make sure no damage had come to him in the small scuffle. The bird was still chirping to himself, his chest puffed out as if he'd single-handedly defeated all the monsters. Cloud let out a breath of exasperated amusement. Aerith was probably right. The bird did seem to be learning a lot from Zack. He could hear the grind of gravel and dirt under Zack's boot as he moved away from him. Cloud straightened back up with Veery in his arms, and Aerith's hand touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said softly. With a faint smile, she turned to look after Zack. It was clear that she wasn't quite thanking Cloud for killing the monsters. "I'm glad he's so happy again." She looked back to Cloud. green eyes bright and happy. He didn't quite have the same energy after... Well, you're a good friend for him. Zack came darting back, waving for them to hurry up, and, laughing, Aerith started after him, carefully picking her way between the monster corpses. "Coming, coming!" Her words confused him, and brought a new apprehension to light. Apparently, Zack had been worried or depressed, and Cloud hadn't noticed in lieu of his own problems. While there hadn't been much time in the hectic events that followed his intrusion into the past, not once had Cloud stopped to consider how Zack was handling everything. The soldier always seemed so sure of himself that Cloud had followed blindly, trusting that Zack had everything worked out. Cloud stood for a moment, watching Aerith follow Zack out of the playground, and considered again leaving all of this behind. He was still selfishly thinking only of himself, though. Zack wouldn't want him to run, didn't want him to leave at all, even if it made life 1,000 times harder. Veery's head bumped into his chest as the bird craned to see Cloud's face and gave an inquiring chirp. Cloud began walking, ignoring the corpses of the monsters. Keep moving forward. It was all he could do, and hopefully it would turn out okay in the end. Cloud could believe that as he watched Zack's cheerful expression and Aerith's beautiful smile as they paused to wait for him to catch up. Wall Market was both the same and different than Cloud remembered. The bustle, the lights, the people were all familiar, with the fever of commerce and underhanded dealings buzzing through the air. The difference could be found in the stares of the people, which had always been mistrustful, but were now openly hostile when they came to rest on him or Zack, though his friends drew most of the attention. When Cloud had frequented the sector in his own soldier uniform, he'd only gotten mistrustful stares because he was a stranger, rather than for his ties to Shinra. He cast a wary eye around the area, mentally noting which people seemed most interested in them, before glancing sideways at Zack. His friends seemed to be ignoring the danger signs, so Cloud pushed his own paranoia back. If Zack wasn't worried, then Cloud was probably just being overly sensitive.
I had no idea this was even down here.
Zack wandered out a few steps, turning and looking around with eager, bright eyes, before he brought his gaze to Cloud and Aerith. With his fists held level to his head, Zack seemed at a loss for words. He almost seemed to tremble with his own eagerness to explore, and took them in with wide eyes.
"This is great,"
he said, hands moving into an encompassing gesture.
"Where should we go first?"
What Zack lacked in wariness, he made up for, in excess, with enthusiasm. It was amusing, and reminded Cloud oddly of an overexcited Yuffie in a materia store. Zack's eyes shone brighter than Mako alone could account for, and he seemed near to bursting with restless excitement. Cloud gave a light, lopsided grin, and absently readjusted his hold on Veery to prevent the bird's escape or an inquisitive passerby from getting a closer look. Just like that, Zack had managed not only to dismiss the aftermath of the fight completely, but bring the mood up to pure enjoyment. Zack turned around again, leaning forward to look down the trodden dirt path that ran between the shops. People walking by had circled around him. He didn't seem to even notice them.
Come on,
Zack hissed. Cloud exchanged a look with Aerith, noting her own bemused expression at Zack's glee at something that was almost ordinary for her. He gamely paced closer when his friend beckoned, though he was nearly deafened as Zack all but hollered in his ear.
I heard you saying you've been here before, and didn't you mention something about where we might get stuff for Veery? You better watch your wallet,
Aerith piped up innocently.
Wouldn't want to catch another thief, would we?
Zack looked away from the sight before him for a moment to give Aerith a wink.
We could catch him. We make a good team. And we have Cloud to help too. I'm sure he and his attack chocobo can corner any thief for us.
Cloud could only look on as Aerith and Zack had another of their almost coded exchanges, hinting at adventures the pair of them had shared. While it should have made Cloud feel left out, he was filled again with a quiet joy at seeing them together and so happy. It did, however, raise an oddly impish impulse in him. Perhaps it was because Yuffie had been on his mind, but Cloud had picked up a thing or two from the energetic thief, and he could almost hear her gleeful voice egging him on. He let the sway of the cloud bump him lightly into Zack's side, having seen his friend's unconscious movement as he'd spoken of his wallet.
Sorry,
Cloud said, as Zack reached a hand out to steady him.
It might have changed a bit since I was here, but I think there's a chocobo stable further down that way.
Cloud pointed up the crowded street. Cloud moved away from Zack again, the weight of his friend's wallet safe in his own pocket. While he'd learned everything he knew about pickpocketing from being on the receiving end of Yuffie, Cloud felt he must have had some skill at it, since neither Zack nor Aerith appeared to have noticed. They were both still looking in the direction he'd indicated. The money would be safer with him anyway, if it was that easy to get one up on Zack. In his arms, Veery shook his head and chirped in protest at the noise and jostling around him.
Don't worry about it,
Zack said.
All right, we have our destination picked out then.
Cloud stuck close to Aerith's side, since Zack was completely immersed in his first experience with Wall Market. It was amusing to watch his friend be sucked into every shop they passed, yet walk away completely unburdened and leaving the shopkeepers scratching their heads in bewilderment. Neither Cloud nor Aerith were bothered much by the hawkers, Cloud putting on a well-practiced air of indifferent menace that kept all but the most zealous sellers at bay. The rest were swept up in Zack's enthusiastic bubble, then left far behind before they had a chance to regroup.
It's a good thing I have such a reliable bodyguard,
Aerith commented dryly, eyes following Zack as he bent over a table shining with some sort of scrap metal. The owner of the stall was expounding on all the uses of the various pieces could be put to, Zack nodding at every other word. Cloud gave a ghost of a smile, remembering another time when she had put that trust in him.
It's strange to see him so excited.
Alive.
He's like a little kid, not like I expected.
While Zack was everything Cloud remembered, kind, friendly, loyal to a fault, he was also a stranger in a familiar guise. Cloud had selfishly built up an image of his friend, of someone who was better, stronger, more of a hero than Cloud could ever be. The thought that Zack was a mere human being was almost disturbing after that, leaving Cloud feeling more than a little guilty. He knew what it was like to be dehumanized, whether from those who would treat them as little more than animals, or those who would try to raise them above the gods. Either way, it was a lonely existence. The need to learn more about his friend was stronger than Cloud's need of a hero, though. With every new interaction, he was seeing more and more of the man who'd been willing to lay down his life for a friend. And somehow, it was infinitely more satisfying than the patchy memories of a desperate escape. To really be friends, rather than have it merely proclaimed that they were, was worth more to Cloud than all the heroes in the world.
You must have only just met him then, Aerith said, laughing lightly. He's always like this. Trying to keep him in one place is like trying to nail jelly to the wall.
Cloud glanced sideways at her, raising a sardonic eyebrow. She flushed lightly and shrugged one shoulder, unapologetic.
It feels like I've known him longer,
Cloud said after a moment. He began to walk again as Zack rushed away from the stall to another further down, already engaging the seller there in animate conversation. When Cloud came close enough to see the face of the seller, he felt his own face go blank in an effort to contain his reaction. The memories of the torture suffered at the hands of the person assailing him mercilessly, and Cloud would never be more thankful that he'd been unrecognizable to them now.
He does know that's a man, right?
Cloud asked Aerith, hoping the note of panic wasn't obvious in his voice as it sounded to him. The future gym owner was much the same as Cloud remembered, slim, loud, and forthright, and wearing a simple yet nice dress. Cloud felt a chill go down his spine and pushed the memories back. In his arms, Veery warbled a curious query, butting his head soothingly against Cloud's arm. The future gym owner was leaning over the table, obviously trying to seduce Zack into either buying wares off the table or behind it. But Zack seemed oblivious to the advances. Next to him, Aerith pouted at the scene.
I doubt it. I'm surprised you noticed, though.
She turned to grin up at him.
Have a lot of practice?
He knew he went red, and Aerith's laughter rang out gaily over the babble of the shopping area. The sound, presumably, caused Zack to look up and abandon the disappointed seller as he gravitated back to them. Cloud bit down the reaction of telling Aerith it was her fault in the first place, only feigning in light of it being an effort in futility. Zack didn't stay with them long, the lure of bright and shiny things inevitably dragging him back into the crowds. Cloud noticed several potential pickpocketers eyeing the distracted soldier, and reassured himself that despite his personal satisfaction, it was probably safer that he was keeping Zack's money on him instead. He did wonder if the Turks were lurking around as well. He wasn't sure exactly how long or how close they'd been watching Aerith, but unless something went completely wrong, they wouldn't bother her seriously for a few years yet. Ahead of them, Zack stopped suddenly, arm thrown out to halt them. "Materia shop!" It was enough to cause Cloud to perk up slightly. Wall Market wouldn't have anything more than the most basic materia, but occasionally he'd find something worthwhile amid their duller companions.
I get most of my materia from research department in the soldier floor, or finding it while on missions, or from phone orders to shops. But hey, it never hurts to look around, right?
Zack said as he led the way into the shop.
Oh, hey, Cloud. Remind me when we get back home to let you go through my materia. I've got plenty, so I'm sure there's a few you can use until we can get you more.
Cloud gave an approving hum to the offer as he looked over the materia stock with a practiced eye. Veery had been compliant the whole trip, quieter than Cloud would have expected. Now the bird glanced up as Cloud leaned over, then leaned forward himself to examine the shining stones with beady eyes. Cloud gave the bird's head a scratch, wondering if Aerith wasn't more right that the chick needed to be returned to Sephiroth soon. His listlessness was a bit worrying compared to his earlier endless energy. None of the materia caught Cloud's eye, and he came to a decision. As much as he didn't want to be in the man's presence personally, the chick could and would become ill if away from Sephiroth for too long. Cloud hadn't raised a half-dozen of the birds without becoming rather fond of them.
We should go,
he said, turning back to his friends.
Veery needs to get back. We could come back later?
He glanced uncertainly at Zack, wondering how long he would be off duty. Leaving here would also mean leaving Aerith behind, but Cloud took comfort in the knowledge that she'd be there whenever they got a chance to visit again. Zack glanced up from where he was examining the stock.
Huh? Oh, right, sorry.
He rubbed the back of his head in obvious embarrassment.
I guess we better get moving. We still need to see if we can find those people to get the stuff for Veery, though. Then we can get him back to his mama.
Cloud found himself leading the way through Wall Market's crowds, Zack and Aerith trailing behind by a few feet. He didn't mind giving them more time together. Zack had invited him along, but Cloud knew that his friend wanted to spend time alone with Aerith too. He contemplated for a moment offering to find Veery's supplies on his own and leaving the pair to their own devices. It wasn't like he didn't know how to get back to the plate and Shinra after all. A selfish part of him didn't want to end this outing just yet. The raw emotions he'd experienced over the past few days leaving him anxious and stressed, and Cloud had dreaded seeing Aerith again. Now though, between Zack's cheerful enthusiasm and Aerith's peaceful presence, Cloud found he'd been quite enjoying himself. He was finally able to relax. Sephiroth's presence, an insubstantial buzz on the edge of perception.
Weapon shop!
At the shout, Cloud's boot heel ground against a piece of broken glass as he stopped and half-turned in Zack's direction. He followed the direction of Zack's gaze and raised an eyebrow at the brightly lit shop entrance that proudly proclaimed its wares.
I know we need to get moving, but can we please stop here? Please, please, please! Just have a look, please!
Why Zack wanted to peruse a weapon shop when he already had a serviceable and unique weapon, he didn't know. But both Zack and Aerith were looking at him for a decision. Zack visibly pleading with his hands clasped together in front of him.
It's fine,
Cloud said, smiling slightly at Zack's immediate cheer.
So long as you hold Viri.
He immediately dumped the chick into Zack's arms as he strode inside. The affronted walk and subsequent yelp made him grin just a bit wider. Cloud had been getting tired of carrying the bird around all over, but didn't feel comfortable enough to let Viri run on his own. This way, both of his babysitting problems were taken care of in one go. The walls were piled with masses and mounds of scrap and junk, a much smaller selection of the store laid out with actual weapons the shop was supposedly selling. Cloud browsed idly, eyes taking in details and differences that surrounded him. The shop owner was a great collector of junk, which even now cluttered his store in every corner. Almost all of it would prove completely useless, and the pile would spread outside his shop into the mountainside heap Cloud remembered.
Hey, Aerith,
Zack said, voice light and a little too innocent.
Have you ever considered arming yourself? I mean, there are a lot of monsters in Midgar these days.
Oh, no, I don't think I could possibly.
You should listen to the man. Midgar's no place to go unarmed.
The low grumble of the owner's voice made Cloud turn. He could see the way the man's suspicious and greedy eyes honed in on Aerith and Zack. He wasn't the worst of the scum that inhabited the slums, but Cloud knew the man was stingy at best, overpriced at worst, and would always look to scam a sucker. Cloud narrowed his eyes slightly. Just so long as he kept the scam monetary, he'd let things be. If the owner tried to summon any sort of bullies to intimidate these Shinras, he'd get a very short lesson, which Cloud would make sure he took to heart.
Just take a look, Zack said. If you don't see anything you like, that's fine. You don't have to make a decision now, but I think it's a good idea. At the very least, if anyone tries to tumble through your flowers again, you can give them a proper hello.
Aerith stifled a laugh, and Zack's own grin turned a little more soft at the obvious memory he'd invoked. I guess you're right, maybe. I'll just look a little. Zack stepped back, absently scratching Viri's tiny crest feathers as Aerith surveyed her surroundings with a pointer finger pressed against her chin and a thoughtful look on her face. The old man who ran the shop continued to eye them with a sort of wary resignation. I think, she said, if I were to get one, it would have to be something like that. Cloud drifted back over to stand behind Zack and Aerith, boots thumping softly on the dirt floor of the shop. The weapon Aerith had indicated was a familiar sight. It was the same rod that she had wielded when Cloud had first met her. He closed his eyes, struck at how things were following the same path, despite his interference. Was this whole effort futile, if even minor things remained the same? Shaking his head to clear it, Cloud dismissed the thought. It was too soon to worry about that. For now, he had other business to take care of.
Why am I not surprised you would favor some blunt object to smack people with?
Zack said. Aerith turned a playful glare on him and smacked his shoulder. Don't be silly. Apparently intent on getting them out of his shop, the old man grunted.
Well, you want it or not?
Zack looked at Aerith, brows raised in question, though he didn't say anything. Aerith frowned, obviously uncertain and looking back at him. I guess it couldn't hurt. You'll be there to protect me, but... Zack smiled fondly at her. reaching up with his free hand to lightly touch the pink ribbon that decorated her hair.
I'm always running all over the place, he said. This way, you can protect people too.
That made her smile brighten up even more. Yes, all right. I don't know if I'll be any good at it, though.
You'll do fine. Now, where did my wallet go? Oh, man, don't tell me.
Oh, Zack, Aerith said with a sigh. Cloud kept his face carefully blank as he stepped closer to Zack, watching his friend's face fall as he patted down all his pockets. It had taken him long enough to notice.
I should charge you my normal delivery fee.
Cloud pulled Zack's procured wallet from his own pocket. He tossed it at Zack and said, in a perfectly deadpan voice,
Veery took it.
To Cloud's amusement, Veery took the opportunity to snap his beak at the wallet, snagging a corner and attempting to tug it out of Zack's grip. He turned to Aerith, whose eyes were full of mirth, and over her mouth to stifle a giggle. Cloud shrugged a shoulder, unapologetic.
It's a good weapon for you, Aerith. You should definitely get it.
Well then, she said brightly, hands clasped behind her back. Since I have the glowing endorsement from 2 experienced warriors, I think I shall.
Hey, give that back!
Zack yelped as he tried to wrestle his wallet out of Veery's grip. Finally, he managed to wrench it free, a little more tattered at one corner than it used to be, and held it up triumphantly. A second later, he let out a yelp as Veery pecked the arm that was holding him. Zack let go more out of surprise than anything. The chick immediately darted around behind Cloud's legs and regarded Zack with something like regal disdain. Zack inspected the little beak mark on his arm, from which the thin line of blood had escaped. He sent Veery a hurt look.
Don't you know you're not supposed to bite the hand that feeds you? Man, that thing is just like his mother.
Zack dabbed at the mark on his arm with a gloved finger, then wiped the blood off on his shirt negligently. He gave a last dirty look to the bird, which turned his beak up at him, then started nibbling on Cloud's pants. Zack turned away and approached the old man. Cloud shifted slightly, freeing Veery's inquisitive beak. It amused him that Zack was so insistent that the chick was like Sephiroth in any way. Cloud had no trouble at all with the chocobo, aside from his insistence at keeping close to Sephiroth, or, as it seemed now, himself. The only thing that reminded Cloud of Sephiroth was the way Veery would strut around sometimes. Otherwise, he was just a fluff ball of pleading eyes and boundless energy. It reminded him more of Zack, actually. He made a note to find out how deeply affected young chocobos were by those other than the one they imprinted on. As Zack settled in to haggle the price of the weapon down, Cloud crouched down, one hand drawing out the chocobo lure materia he kept on him. He activated it with a small lick of power, just enough to entice Veery to play. The chick was probably getting restless, having been carried around for the past hour or so. Veery immediately trotted around Cloud's side, eyes fixed on the dimly glowing materia. Aerith wandered over to crouch down nearby, Cloud playing an impromptu game of keep away with Veery. Cloud tossed the materia back and forth a few times, watching her out of the corner of his eye, before he tossed it gently in her direction. She caught it with a look of surprise, but smiled again as Veery hopped over, wings fanning the air impatiently.
You'll have to tell me why his mother is such a big issue with Zack,
Aerith said, rolling the materia between Veery's legs and back to Cloud. Veery tried to follow it. He ended up overbalancing to sprawl on his back. His legs scrambled in the dirt as he got to his feet and charged after his prey.
Did she do something to him? I can't imagine what would make it so funny, though.
The look she gave Cloud was expectant. He sighed, not wanting to explain, yet unable to refuse when Aerith asked so plaintively. It's not like it was a big secret, just embarrassing. Cloud had no idea why Zack was so insistent on using the term mother.
When chocobos hatch, they attach themselves to the first creature they see, which is usually another chocobo,
he said, eyes focusing on the little chick to distract himself from what he was saying.
In this case...
Oh dear, she gasped, letting out a soft laugh. I think I see where this is going. But who?
The General,
Cloud bit out. Aerith missed his next toss, and Veery ran into her leg when the materia bounced off it. Cloud glanced up at her face. He was surprised to see she had buried it in her hands, shoulders shaking with muffled mirth. He sighed, leaning out his hands to retrieve the errant materia. Veery shook himself, preening one of his wings to soothe his wounded pride, before trotting back to Cloud's side. Apparently he was done playing. Zack hasn't said that to him yet? Aerith asked, her voice trembling from suppressed laughter.
He doesn't have a Masmune-shaped hole in him yet.
Aerith sat back on her heels, wiping tears from her eyes as she grinned at him. Do keep him in one piece for me. I'm rather fond of him after all.
No promises,
he said, picking Veery up as he got to his feet again. He extended a hand to help Aerith to her feet, struck again as her warm palm slid against his. How very alive she felt. They waited in companionable silence as Zack concluded the transaction and came towards them, staff in hand.
I should have a lot of free time now,
Zack said as he passed the weapon off to Aerith.
So I should be able to drop by again, maybe even tomorrow. I can show you how to keep it in top condition. And Jill really drove weapon care home.
He lowered his voice in obvious imitation.
Use brings about wear, tear, and rust.
Aerith laughed softly, hands cradling the staff in an unsure grip. He'd be glad you were taking that seriously. Zack gave her a soft smile.
I'm just doing what he would have.
The fondness in Zack's voice as he spoke of Angeal made Cloud regret that he could remember nothing of the soldier, since Zack seemed to hold him in such high regard. He wondered if he could ask Zack what happened to the man. His friend had seemed reluctant to speak of it before, so Cloud doubted he would bother asking. He was all too aware of how much even a question could hurt the heart. Cloud took the lead again when they exited the store, weaving through the crowd with barely a thought. They didn't part as readily for him as they had for Zack, his partial trooper uniform less conspicuous than soldier first-class outfit. But it didn't take too long for the trio to travel the length of the street. He knew they were close when Veery perked up in his arms. A distant chocobo warble came to them, audible even above the crowd's noise. It was easy enough to pick out the building where they kept the chocobos. Not only was it bigger than most buildings in the slum, though certainly not as much as the one near it or Aerith's church, but even over the smell that hung about the slums itself, there was a smell of animals. The wide doors stood open, the sound of shuffling, cooing, and the occasional walk echoed out of the dim interior. From nearby, obviously guarding the rather ornate doors, a man watched them. The so-called stable was as ramshackle as the rest of the slums, though perhaps a bit better in quality. It was nothing like the lofty, impressive building out near the swamps. Zack made his way over and rapped lightly on the door. It swung slightly, creaking as it did. "Excuse me," he called. Though it was not as loud here, the din of the nearby market could still be heard as a soft, constant layer of murmuring sound. A chocobo answered his call with a warbling trill. "Anybody here?" Aerith stepped in close enough that she bumped lightly against Zack's side. From the dim interior of the stable, a figure emerged, wiping his hand on a rag and looking at them with an air of boredom.
"Can I help you?" "Hey, sorry to intrude,"
Zack said breezily.
"But a friend of mine recently acquired a chocobo, and we're trying to find a way to get all the necessary items for his care."
The man glanced them over, face tightening slightly at the obvious rank Zack portrayed. His gaze lingered momentarily on Aerith before turning towards Cloud. He seemed to mostly ignore Cloud, but Veery certainly caught his attention.
"Is that so?"
Zack kept his smile up and light, though Cloud noticed a certain sort of weariness crept into the edges of his expression.
"You lot obviously have some chocobos, so maybe you could give us a hand or direct us to your supplier?"
Cloud could already see that this wasn't going to end well. Zack had charm and charisma, but in the slums, that counted a lot less than in other places, especially in the economic black hole of War Market. While most of the sellers Zack had encountered so far were bemused by his bright attitude, as well as hoping to take advantage of what they perceived to be weakness, these men were nowhere near as tolerant. The only owner of chocobos in the slums had to be Don Conio. He kept a few to pull his gaudy carriage around, but otherwise they were mostly to show how rich and powerful he was. No one would dare to go after the Don's property unless they wanted to be found lying dead in the gutter the next day. While it pleased Cloud to find that there were still chocobo stables even now, he knew the Don's men wouldn't be easy to deal with. These were not merchants looking for a sale at exorbitant prices. These were thugs, bullies, cutthroats, who were more inclined to kill you outright and learn later from your corpse what your business was. They obviously wanted nothing to do with Shinra. Expressions mulishly unhelpful in the face of Zack's soldier uniform. That and Cloud didn't like how the man was eyeing Veery. He'd knife Cloud and book it away with the valuable bird given the chance, which Cloud was not inclined to provide. Cloud stepped forward deliberately, putting himself between the man and Zack, and forcing the handler to take notice of him instead. Cloud had noticed how easily he'd been dismissed, and intended to make it a mistake the man would regret for a while. He caught the handler's eyes, then deliberately let Veery drop to the ground with a quiet, "Stay." While the bird was too young to understand, his breed was intelligent enough to recognize a dangerous situation and stick close to his protector. It was an intimidating move, and already Cloud could see the wariness in the man's eyes. Why would Cloud have let go of such a valuable bird in this situation, unless he was sure that any move against him would end in his favor? Out of the corner of his eyes, Cloud could see the other handlers taking a much closer interest in the engagement. If Cloud or Zack tried anything, they'd quickly find themselves at a disadvantage. Nothing they couldn't handle, but the men didn't know that, and Cloud really didn't want to start his career in the slums as a murderer.
We require a supply of food for a growing chick, as well as grooming supplies. Stabling will not be an issue, as his master lives up on the plate,
Cloud said quietly, shifting his weight to one leg as he crossed his arms. At his feet, Veery puffed out his chest, striking a regal pose as he glared up at the other man. A sneer crossed the handler's face, and he shifted into a more hostile stance, one hand resting obviously on a knife at his side.
"We don't do business with Shinra scum,"
he said, spitting at Cloud's feet in deliberate insult. Veery flapped his wings and warbled in alarm, but didn't stray from the relative safety of Cloud's side.
"These are the Don's birds, and everything about them belongs to him. Not even your Shinra bigwig would want to tangle with the boss. Why don't you turn around and crawl back to your master's feet?"
Cloud felt a flare of anger at those words, even though he'd been expecting it. He would die before he ever called Sephiroth master, and the insult almost broke his tight control. His temples throbbed with Genova's buzz for just a second, before Cloud forced himself to calm down. The man had taken a step back when Cloud's eyes had sparked with rage.
"I see,"
Cloud drawled slowly. He turned on his heel and saluted Zack crisply.
"Permission to return and report to the general that his personal attention is needed to procure supplies for his chocobo, sir." "Fuck! What'd you say, boy?"
the handler demanded before Zack could respond. Cloud turned back, face blank, as he regarded the man silently. He could see the other men around him looked worried, and at least one had ducked away. Whether for reinforcements or to report to his boss, Cloud didn't know. But it wouldn't matter either way.
"General Sephiroth has acquired a new chocobo,"
he explained slowly, his voice even and monotone. At his feet, Veery warbled at the sound of his owner's name.
"Currently, there are no such facilities to support the bird in Shinra, so supplies must be acquired elsewhere. You are the closest supplier. I'm sure the general will come down to discuss it with him."
The handler's face was a picture, eyes narrowed in hatred and mouth twisted in an ugly scowl. Cloud didn't feel any particular amusement at the sight, though. All he wanted to do was get the supplies for Veery and leave. This was the easiest way. These men were the type to sell under the table to make a bit of extra profit, but they'd never do it for Shinra.
"You shit-eating little bitch!"
The man spat furiously, tossing his rag onto the ground in his aggravation and causing Veery to jump backwards onto Cloud's boot, walking at the discarded cloth. Cloud paid the insult no mind. The opinion of a frustrated grunt was hardly his concern.
"Fine."
Cloud could practically hear his teeth grinding as he gritted them.
"What do you need?" "For now, we need a supply of food to be delivered to the train station. On a weekly basis would be best,"
Cloud said crisply, inwardly hoping that he wasn't taking it too far. Zack would step in if he needed to, hopefully.
"Since the chocobo is a black, he will need about half again as much as your normal chick. I don't know who you do business with, nor do I care, but if you can get mimet greens, you will be compensated for your trouble."
And if Sephiroth had to pay through the nose for his pet, Cloud didn't see a downside to it. Plus, Cloud had worked his ass off to make sure his own chocobos had been fed only the best food.
"We will inspect the supplies before paying."
The man's face went redder with every demand.
"I don't trust you to try and skimp us Shinra scum, after all." "You think you can just come in here and order us around like—"
the handler burst out, shaking a fist in Cloud's face. Cloud didn't even flinch as he caught the fist in his hand, forcing the man back a step as he twisted it. Veery darted forward to peck at the man's leg, then darted back before he could kick out at the sharp stab of pain.
"I'm not ordering you to do anything,"
Cloud said levelly, still holding the man's fist.
"I am doing things your way. Your boss makes a profit, and he gets a good word in with Shinra. That might not mean as little to him as you think."
The last part was a guess, but Cloud knew at some point Corneo would provide information to Shinra. It was one of the reasons so it was a safe enough bet that the Don wouldn't be averse to the arrangement.
"Why don't you let Stewart go, friend?"
Another man cut in smoothly, walking up to the pair.
"Then we can talk business."
Cloud regarded the newcomer silently for a moment, before releasing the swearing handler. The handler stormed away, massaging his wrist and calling Cloud everything but a child of the planet. Turning to the newcomer, Cloud noticed that he dressed a bit sharper than the general cut of the men hanging around the stables. Cloud said nothing, merely waited for the other man to make the first move.
"I'm Danny. I take care of ordering our supplies from the chocobo farm out east. You know the place?"
The man rumbled as he took out a pad of paper from a pocket and pulled a pencil from behind his ear.
"Yes. They're good men there, and they have quality materials." "Right,"
Danny grunted, then made a few notes on the pad.
"Here's what I think we can provide, for now. Fancy stuff like mimet greens takes a lot of getting, you know."
He passed the pad over to Cloud. Cloud spent the next few minutes haggling, aware of Zack and Aerith's silent presence behind him, and kept half an eye out on Veery. The little chick had no intentions of straying any further than a few inches from Cloud's boots, and with the threat of the General's wrath over them, none of the men still hanging around seemed inclined to make an attempt at the bird. Finally satisfied with the arrangements, Danny straightened up from where he'd been hunched over Cloud. The man was considerably taller than Cloud, and he'd have to bend over some to keep the notepad evenly between them.
"Hey, Rusty!"
Danny called, waving a piece of paper at another passing handler. Rusty trotted over, taking the sheet from the other man's hand.
"Special order. Run it by the boss and explain the situation. Carefully. Don't get your knickers in a twist,"
Rusty said, sneering at Cloud even as he answered his co-worker.
"I know how to handle it."
Danny turned back to Cloud again, nodding his head neutrally.
"We don't have anything on hand that is up to your standards. These chocobos don't need to win races, just look pretty, after all. But we'll have a box of greens waiting at the train station before the last train tonight, and that should last until your first order comes in."
"Fine," Cloud said shortly. He was already tired at this place. His delivery service skills had given him confidence that he'd gotten the best price he could for the best supplies they could provide. That was enough for now. Bending to collect Veery without another word, he turned back to his friends.
"Come on,"
he said lowly, putting a hand on Zach's arm to hurry his friend along before either could say anything.
"We're not welcome here anymore."
When they'd gotten far enough away that the noise and bustle of War Market had stolen even the smell of chocobos away, Cloud turned a worried look to Zach.
"Was that okay?"
He hoped he hadn't gotten Zach into trouble by taking over and ordering the supplies, but Cloud knew chocobos better than Zach, so it only made sense that he do the actual bartering.
"Okay,"
Zach parroted.
"You were awesome, Cloud."
Laughter laced every word before Zach pretty much tackled him, arms going around his neck and giving him a squeeze.
The look on that guy's face was priceless.
Cloud would never admit to the startled squeak, cry of surprise, when he suddenly found a couple 100 pounds of Zach hanging off him. His friend continued to rejoice loudly in Cloud's ear, as if Cloud had done something amazing. Through his bafflement and embarrassment at all the jostling, Cloud gave Aerith a wide-eyed look of near panic, unsure what to do with the clearly ecstatic Zach. Her grin did nothing to reassure him.
"Oh man, I wish I'd had a camera. It would have been nice to keep that forever."
"Zach, stop!" His feeble protest at the manhandling went unheard, even as Cloud tried to pry Zach's arm from around his neck with his free hand. Veery complained loudly in his other arm, clawed feet digging mercilessly into Cloud's side.
"You're both terrible,"
Aerith said, though there was nothing in her voice that said she felt it was true.
"I might be a first class, and that means I'm a warmongering soldier, but Cloud's the one mean enough to threaten people with Sephiroth. That's just cruel and unusual,"
Zach crowed, cheerfully ruffling Cloud's hair. As quickly as the attack had started, suddenly Cloud found himself staggering as he was released. He felt completely confused at what had just happened. He ran a hand through his hair to straighten it from Zach's tender attentions, and tried to keep the traumatized look off his face. Zach was clearly insane. Why hadn't he remembered how unpredictable his friend was? Underneath the embarrassment, however, Cloud could admit a guilty feeling of pleasure at Zach's praise. It felt good to do something right.
"We'll have to let Sephiroth know about the costs, but that won't be too bad. I doubt he'd even notice if we just tagged it onto the budget. Though Lazard might have something to say to us about that,"
Zach said. Aerith swatted his arm lightly.
"Zach? What? It's still not as bad as sticking Sephiroth on someone." "I wouldn't have set Sephiroth on them,"
Cloud mumbled, running a hand over Veery's ruffled feathers to settle the chick.
"What makes you think he'd do it even if I asked?"
He ducked his chin behind his scarf and kept his gaze on the ground at his feet, knowing by the hot feeling that his face was still flushed with embarrassment. Cloud felt as if all eyes were on him now, which made him squirm uncomfortably. He dreaded the rumors that would float around the market about the two of them now.
"You kidding?"
Zach asked breezily.
"Like Sephiroth would turn down a chance to come down and terrorize someone. It's better than being bored up there in Shinra's lofty tower."
Zach wiggled his fingers up at the plate, as if they could just look up and see the building itself.
"Well, if you could drag him away from his books long enough. But I bet if you set your case right, he wouldn't mind. Might just do it to make the execs sweat and wonder what he's up to now. Catch him when one of the execs are talking to him, and he might even say thank you."
Cloud listened to Zach's teasing incredulously, unable to picture the image of Sephiroth Zach was presenting. His friend had to be exaggerating for humor, but Cloud had trouble even envisioning Sephiroth speaking civilly to anyone, let alone staying long enough for people who annoyed him. Around them, Wall Market's glitter and lights faded away, people becoming scarce as they made their way through to the monster-infested areas between sectors. To their luck, their earlier journey seemed to have cleared out all of the nearby monsters, and they passed through unmolested.
"I guess we should probably head back up. We need to hunt down Sephiroth, and that could take the rest of the afternoon."
Zach's comment made Cloud look up, realizing with a pang that they were near the large doors leading to Sector 5's market, and it was time to say goodbye.
"Why don't you wait here, Cloud, and I'll walk Aerith back the rest of the way."
Yeah," he replied, glancing sideways at Aerith. It was the least he could do, to allow the pair at least a few minutes alone. Cloud had monopolized too much of their time together as it was. Bye, Aerith." He nodded awkwardly at her. Now that the high of seeing her again was wearing off, Cloud had no idea how friendly he was supposed to act with her. Aerith seemed to sense his hesitancy, and stepped forward to wrap her arms around him in a soft hug. Cloud's breath caught as her scent washed over him, smelling of her flowers and purity. He raised his free hand hesitantly, resting it gently on her back and applying a little pressure in return of the hug. Between them, Veery chirped a protest at being trapped between two bodies again, and Aerith stepped back with a smile. "It was nice meeting you, Cloud. You have to come visit me sometime on your own as well." A bright smile accompanied her words, and she clasped her hands behind her back. Cloud nodded hesitantly back, his eyes unfocused as memories of other times with Aerith floated up in his mind. She didn't deem this satisfactory, reaching out to clasp his hand in hers. "Promise?" she asked firmly, her green eyes staring up into his. "Yeah, I promise," he replied softly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Aerith laughed and nodded cheerfully before releasing his hand. "Good! Now, I think you said something about walking me back?" Aerith turned to Zack with an expectant look. Side by side, they strolled away.
"Absolutely. I'd be remiss in my duties as a wonderful boyfriend if I made you walk back to your beloved flowers alone. I'll be right back."
Zack stayed quiet, just staring upward and ambling along in no real hurry. He was content to bask in the experience of spending a good time with two of the people he cared about. Above him, the underside of the plate was dark and forbidding, but somehow it seemed a little brighter than usual.
"He's a good kid,"
he said at length, once he was sure they were far off enough that Cloud couldn't overhear them. It occurred to Zack that he had no real idea how old Cloud was physically or mentally, though he didn't really think it mattered. After what he'd learned, Zack couldn't ignore the urge he had to look after him and make sure he didn't fall to pieces. And that, maybe, just maybe, the guy got a little piece of happiness. Zack felt happy with his life, and he was the kind of man who wanted to spread that happiness around to everyone. Cloud, like Sephiroth, definitely seemed like he deserved a little of that happiness.
A little weird, but good.
"Zack," Aerith admonished gently, though she couldn't seem to help but give a small smile in response to his own impish grin.
"He's not weird at all. If anything, next to you, he's quite normal."
She swayed into his side and slid her arms around one of his. "But he is quite sad. I think I made him a little bit sadder too." How could he explain to Aerith that it was because she was special to Cloud, that he'd known her in another time, far away, and lost her, apparently so violently that he'd never quite recovered? He couldn't, and not only because he didn't want to upset her. Zack knew Aerith was a wonderful, strong young woman, even if she was a bit shy, and maybe unsure about the world still. He could see the promise of strength in her, had seen it since he met her. It was probably part of what had drawn him to her. He smiled faintly as he remembered their first meeting again. The expression dropped after a second. Zack looked down into Aerith's face, taking in the small frown and the insecurity and worry she wore openly, and moved his hand to clasp hers in his. He gave it a gentle squeeze, well aware of how his strength could hurt her if he wasn't careful.
"He lost someone,"
Zack said carefully. "A lot like you, from the way he described her. I think you remind him of her a bit, but not in a bad way. He'd never directly lie to her if he could avoid it. A lot of his life, Zack had to keep secrets from her because it was Shinra business, and you couldn't go spilling Shinra business. Just like she apparently didn't want to tell him she was an ancient yet, though he still wasn't sure what that really meant. It was apparently something special. Zack didn't need anyone to tell him Aerith was special, and he certainly didn't think she was that way for something so material. She was special just because she was Aerith. I think being friends with you would do him some good." He smiled at her as they came up short before the church. Zack studied her face, thinking about all the things Cloud had told him, about how Tseng had kidnapped her, something that still made betrayal fizzle in him, about Hojo had caged her and tried to do horrible things to her, and about how Sephiroth had killed her. Some part of him wondered how Cloud looked at her, how he felt about her, but Zack wasn't particularly worried about that. He wasn't really the type to get worked up over that sort of thing, and he trusted Aerith, just like she trusted him to be a bit of an idiot and a flirt and nothing more.
More than that, he trusted Cloud, even if he hadn't known him that long. Somehow, it felt like he'd known him all his life. Zack suspected it came from sharing a similar sadness and burden, even if Cloud didn't realize it. In the future that might never be, Cloud had become his living legacy, had accepted the burden of Zack's pride, honor, and dreams. In the here and now, Zack was Angeal's legacy, had accepted the burden of Angeal's pride, honor, and dreams. It wasn't the sort of burden that was carried easily, but it was the sort that was carried proudly and sadly. His heart remained heavy with the things he knew. He wanted to confide in her, but at the same time, he didn't feel comfortable dragging her into this mess just yet. It might be a little selfish, but he needed, someone there who could be genuinely happy when things became too much. Aerith had been that for him since he'd met her. Lifting his hand, Zack lightly touched her hair with his gloved fingertip and pressed a careful kiss against her temple. "Be careful, okay?" he murmured. She smelled of flowers and something like he imagined sunlight and happiness might smell like. A certain indefinable sweetness and warmth. "If I get a chance, I'll come visit again tomorrow." Aerith closed her eyes as Zack's lips met her forehead, and looked for a moment like she was about to cry. "Of course I will," she whispered, opening her eyes to give him a fond grin. She raised a hand to grasp Zack's gloved one in hers, and drew it away from her hair to lace their fingers together. Stepping back, Aerith let their hands stretch out between them. "I look forward to seeing you then. Maybe you'll have some time to teach me how to use this." She gave him a coquettish look, tapping her new staff with a nail. It made a dull, metallic rapping noise, and she wrinkled her nose slightly. "Absolutely," Zack said, some of that old cheer returning. "I've never been that great with staffs the few times I used them, but I think I can His words stuttered to a halt as she stepped forward, cutting him off when she rose on tiptoes to press a soft kiss to the corner of his mouth. A moment later, she stepped back, face flushed in embarrassment at the bold move. "Thank you for the wonderful time." She still smiled up at him through her blush. "You'd better get back to Cloud before he thinks he's been forgotten." Zack gaped, brows flirting with his hairline. His expression melted into what he expected was a rather stupid smile. He couldn't help but reach out and gather her to him in a swift embrace. Couldn't help but press another kiss to her forehead. "All right, I know when I'm no longer wanted," he teased, happy as a chocobo in a field of greens. "I'll go look after the rather sad-looking cat I found, and see if I can't get him happy, sassy, and purring." He pulled back, forehead resting against hers for a moment, eyes crinkled at the edges from the width of his smile, then released her at last. "I'll see you soon." Somehow, Zack was starting to think that goodbyes were just too final for him. With a last wave and look, he turned and headed back. He felt a little like he could take on the whole world right now.
No one bothered Cloud as he stood waiting for Zack's return. There weren't many people about anyway, but his Shinra uniform made them take a wide berth around him. Perhaps rumors of the Shinra had already spread, and the toughs had decided to leave them be for the moment. Cloud was glad for that, even if he wouldn't have any trouble dealing with them. He was not in the mood to deal with more thick-headed bullies. When Zack did return, Cloud didn't comment on the wide grin. He was merely happy that his friends were happy. The return trip through the slums and on the train occurred mostly in silence, Zack distracted and lost in his thoughts. Cloud didn't mind the silence. He was used to it. It was when people started talking to him that he got lost and bewildered. They exited the train, Zack whistling a tune Cloud didn't recognize, and Veery cooing along, and began making their way back towards the Shinra building. Cloud knew they'd have to track down Sephiroth now, a task he was not looking forward to, but it looked like Zack had forgotten all about their job. Just as he opened his mouth to break into Zack's happy haze, a voice rang out across the courtyard they were in.
"Zack! Hey, Zack!"
A soldier jogged towards them, one hand waving in the air to catch Zack's attention. Cloud stopped as his friend did, curious as to what the other soldier wanted. When he got close enough, the man lowered his hand. His mouth, visible under the helmet, was stretched into a grin.
"There you are, man. I've been looking everywhere for you." "Hey, Kunzel!"
The soldier's head, tilted towards Cloud then.
Is this the mysterious we?
The soldier second muttered, then shook his head.
That's not important. I need to tell you.
Zack, obviously choosing to ignore him, had turned to Cloud and said,
Cloud, this is my buddy I mentioned, Kunzel. Kunzel, this is Cloud.
Kunzel lifted his hand in greeting.
Nice to meet you, Cloud,
he said, then turned back to Zack.
Are you even listening to me?
Cloud nodded in greeting to the other man, though he needn't have bothered with acknowledging the introduction at all, as Kunzel's attention had already returned to Zack in full.
What?
Zack asked.
I've been trying to get a hold of you for a while now.
Zack blinked, then blinked again, his brows furrowed, lips parting and head tilted in a rather puppyish look of confusion.
Phone?
The other second muttered something about not expecting Zack to be hard to find, then bulled on.
The construction zone in Sector 3 is under attack by a flock of airmen. Laz had sent in a second and a couple of thirds to take care of it. Unfortunately, they just found out there are several griffins nesting in the area too. And they're not pleased about the ruckus. Lazard wants you to go give them a hand, and sends apologies for bothering you on your time off. He said he couldn't get a hold of you.
Zack pulled his phone out and grimaced at what he found.
All right, I'll take care of it.
He glanced at Cloud and frowned.
Hey, Kunzel, do you know where Sephiroth is?
Kunzel shook his head.
I know he's in the building. The receptionists were talking about him earlier.
Zack cast a helpless look towards Cloud.
You don't need to find him. We can do it later. If you want, I can give you the access card to get back home.
For a moment, Cloud had thought Zack would bring him along, before the brief hope was dashed. Of course, Zack didn't need him tagging along. It was Shinra business, and Cloud was not an official part of Soldier, even if he wanted to help out. That left him with the daunting task of tracking down Sephiroth by himself. It was nice of Zack to give him an out, but Cloud knew he'd have to learn to face the man sooner or later. He might as well do it now. Without Zack there, at least Cloud wouldn't have to worry about his friend as well.
I can find him,
Cloud said, turning his head to gaze unseeingly at the building Kunzel had indicated. The Genova buzz had returned, though it was nowhere near as intense as it had been the previous day. Zack frowned at Cloud for a second, then nodded.
You sure?
He asked.
You better hurry, before you get into more trouble.
His friend still looked worried, so Cloud tried to sound reassuring as he said, I'll be fine. He hoped he would be. Facing Sephiroth in battle was intimidating and painful, yet somehow facing him over the matter of a chocobo seemed infinitely worse. Cloud had no idea how Sephiroth would react, or even how he himself would. Kunzel hadn't looked away from Cloud, curiosity apparent despite his impatient stance. Cloud wasn't sure what to make of Zack's friend, other than wondering what had happened to the man in his own time. Was he still alive? Wondering what had become of Zack? Or had he been killed in the disasters that had encompassed the world? While he would never know the answer, Cloud did hope that Kunzel was still alive, still remembered Zack as the friend he'd been.
All right, but I want you to take these.
Here Zack paused to pat down his pockets again and produced the access cards necessary for traversing the Shinra building.
If I need to get around, they know me, and I can get someone to spring for me. But you...
Zack grinned, then turned towards Kunzel.
Let's go then. You can give me more details as we go. Oh, Zack, you know this isn't really my thing.
Kunzel grumbled, even as he trotted after Zack, and the pair headed off.
You're a Turk in soldier clothing, I'm telling you.
Zack shot back. Cloud watched Zack walk away, a leaden feeling in his stomach. Just because he knew it had to be done, didn't make it any easier to turn around and walk towards the towering Shinra building. He let Veery down, the little bird's claws tapping against the concrete with two little snicks, before the chick trotted gamely along at his side. Cloud closed his eyes as a faint breeze caressed his face, and gathered himself to face his worst enemy. He glanced down at the cards in his hands, and recognized one from the previous night that Zack had used to access the apartments. The other was glossy, the Shinra logo emblazoned in the corner, and looked similar to the floor access cards Cloud remembered from his own adventures in the headquarters. He wondered what Tifa would do if she were here. Would she have supported him, matching his stubbornness to make sure Cloud didn't falter? The cool air from outside turned static, and temperature-controlled as Cloud stepped through the sliding doors of Shinra Tower. When the doors closed with a whoosh of pressured air, Veery walked, nearly tripping over his feet as he whirled around to glare and posture at them. Cloud paused, then used a boot to push the chick further into the building and break the staring contest. Veery complained loudly as he ruffled his down and strutted away with his wounded dignity wrapped around him. A receptionist looked up at the unusual sound, her eyes first locking on Cloud before inevitably trailing down to the floor and the little chocobo. Cloud expected her to try to stop them, but obviously the rumors had spread this far as well. Instead of demands to leave, Cloud found himself on the receiving end of a smile as she leaned forward for a better look at the chick. "Oh, it's adorable! I'd heard one of the soldiers came in with a baby chocobo. Are you new, perhaps?" she asked, gesturing with one hand at his trooper uniform. "I know the paperwork takes forever, even for the simplest requests." Around Cloud, other people were taking an interest at the commotion in the entryway. Curious glances focused on him from all sides. He had wanted to just slip in, drop Veery off with his owner, and leave as fast as possible, but it didn't look like he'd be able to get away. He frowned slightly, deciding it would be best to continue with the cover story to try and keep the rumors at bay.
"No, I'm not Soldier, but I need to return him."
He gestured with a hand at Veery.
"To his owner. Zack, Soldier First Fair, gave me clearance."
Cloud raised the keycard as proof, wishing he'd just taken the endless stairs to bypass all of this.
"Oh, Soldier Fair!"
the secretary exclaimed, beaming at him again.
"He's in and out of here all the time, isn't he? Is he on duty?"
He hadn't expected his first obstacle to be a gossip-happy secretary. She appeared already to be chatting on, not giving him time to think up an answer.
"No, never mind. Shinra security and all. I know you can't say. Do tell Zack that Layla said hello. Oh, I never did catch your name."
"Cloud," he replied, bewildered at the overly friendly attitude. His last memories of Shinra headquarters were of fleeing civilians and gun-happy soldiers, so this experience was unique to him. She smiled, an action he noticed she did often, and waved him by.
"Nice to meet you, Cloud. I'm sure we'll see each other again."
He nodded uncertainly, then quickly cut over to the glass elevators. The buzz of low conversation already floated after him, and he even thought he saw someone pointing down at him from the upper balcony. He couldn't be more grateful when the elevators dinged, indicating the arrival of one of the cars. Veery hopped back onto his boot before the door slid open, but Cloud merely walked into the elevator. The momentum made the bird run forward a few steps. Zack seemed to think that Sephiroth would be hard to find, and if Cloud had had to search the entirety of Shinra headquarters and risk running into Turks, the President's lackeys, or worst of all, Hojo, that might have been the case. But Cloud always knew where Sephiroth was these days. He pressed the button for one of the highest floors, his face impassive, as his mind began to race. All he had to do was deliver Veery and leave. Cloud kept telling himself that, as the elevator rose higher and higher. When the elevators stopped on the 62nd floor, Cloud spared a moment to be grateful that there hadn't been interruptions. If the elevator had stopped anywhere else, he might have chickened out and gone back to wait for Zack. Now that he was here, though, Cloud stepped forward into the smell of books and ink, mixed with the metallic smell that permeated all parts of the tower. Sephiroth was in the Shinra library, and that sent a shiver down Cloud's spine. The last time Sephiroth had been found in such a place. Veery shot straight across the hall towards the nearest door, the door towards which the insistent tugging at the back of Cloud's mind directed him. Cloud frowned at the little black body, his head buzzing unpleasantly as he tried to quell the nauseous feeling in his stomach. He paused for a moment outside the doorway Veery had disappeared through, gathering himself for the confrontation. The peace he'd gathered from his visit with Aerith and Zack buoyed him, and helped Cloud make the final steps into the room. Sephiroth stood near a bookshelf, book in hand, looking as pristine and powerful as he always did. His fall of silver hair shone in the harsh electric lighting and shifted as the man turned slightly. Green eyes that had been focused on the ecstatic chocobo at his feet turned towards Cloud, and he was caught in the familiar hold of Sephiroth's gaze.
"Sir,"
Cloud managed to choke out. Now he really did wish he'd waited for Zack.
"I brought—"
He didn't finish, just gestured obviously at Beery. All he needed was for Sephiroth to dismiss him, and then he could escape and hide himself in Zack's quarters again. Slowly, Sephiroth looked back to the chocobo chick and frowned faintly.
"I was under the impression that you were properly equipped to take care of it,"
he said, even as he stepped aside to escape the affectionate chocobo. Cloud frowned and glanced down at Veery as Sephiroth took another step away from the happy chick. Obviously, Sephiroth had expected to wash his hands of the chocobo, an idea that made Cloud scoff to himself. Cloud, with his experience with the creatures, knew that not even Sephiroth's cold attitude would do more than inconvenience Veery in the long run.
"It's not a matter of care, sir,"
he said quietly, forcing himself to take a further step into the room.
"Veery has imprinted himself on you."
Almost against his will, Cloud found himself amused at the sight of a tiny ball of fluff lovingly rubbing against Sephiroth's leather boot. To distract himself, Cloud let his eyes trail up the book still held loosely in the man's hands. He couldn't see most of the title, and Cloud wondered how long Sephiroth had been researching about his past before he had stumbled upon Hojo's trap. Sephiroth's frown deepened, brows furrowing slightly as he turned away. With a black-gloved hand, Sephiroth gestured for Cloud to come further into the room.
"Come here."
Cloud felt an icy ball of dread drop into his stomach at those words. It was hard enough just being in the man's presence. Why did Sephiroth seem insistent on prolonging the uncomfortable meeting? He took another few hesitant steps forward, coming to a stop again in the middle of the room. Sephiroth had turned his attention back to the bookshelves. Cloud felt the weight of Zack's sword on his back, the burning desire to at least draw the weapon in the presence of this man nearly overwhelming. He kept his hands at his sides, unwilling to give Sephiroth more reason to be interested in him.
"The chocobo's provisions have been taken care of. Zack is coordinating with Director Lazard for the continued support,"
he said, in lieu of following Sephiroth's order completely. Cloud hoped, rather futilely he knew, that Sephiroth would lose interest and just let him go. Sephiroth glanced over his shoulder at him again, then turned back to the bookshelf and began to pull a selection down.
"I expect Lazard will inform me of it,"
he said, and turned expectantly towards Cloud.
"Your name was Cloud, correct?" "Yes, sir,"
he mumbled in response to the query. Sephiroth barely waited for acknowledgement before he held out the books for him, obviously expecting Cloud to hold them for him. Having no other choice but to move closer, the implicit order clear, Cloud reluctantly crossed the rest of the room. Sephiroth barely gave him time to take hold of the books before he released them and turned back to the shelves. Cloud had to lurch forward to keep the topmost book from sliding to the floor. That brought him closer than he liked to the man. The smell of leather and something floral invaded Cloud's senses. He froze, eyes focused desperately on a small patch of Sephiroth's coat he could see through the curtain of silver hair. Cloud wasn't sure what would draw more attention to himself, staying still or stepping away. Unable to stand the hair-raising feeling of being so close, he took a few quick steps back, the books clutched to his chest protectively. Sephiroth finished collecting several more books before turning.
"Bring those with you,"
he said, and strode out of the room. Cloud followed silently after the intimidating form, keeping his gaze locked on the ground at his feet. The entire floor was remarkably empty, and he put it down to Sephiroth's presence. No one would want to hang around and risk incurring the wrath of the legendary general. Cloud was struck by a sudden pang of sympathy for the man. It couldn't be easy, he knew, to be so isolated. As far as Cloud knew, Sephiroth did not have any close friends anymore, aside from possibly Zack, who was friends with everyone. They entered the empty mayor's office. There were stacks of books strewn on the desk indicating Sephiroth had been at his research for a time. Cloud glanced down at the books in his arms. The subject matter appeared to be as he feared, biogenetics and similar subjects. So Sephiroth really was already heading down the path that would lead to his madness. Was there anything Cloud could do then? Sephiroth deposited the books in his hands on the desk among other stacks.
Put them here.
He turned and leaned back against the desk, arms crossed over his chest. The books made a soft thump as Cloud set them on the desk. He was hyper-aware of the man leaning against it only a few inches away. He backed up again, unwilling to turn his back to Sephiroth, even though there had been no hostility yet, even when Cloud had all but disobeyed an order. He doubted it was something Sephiroth encountered often, and, Cloud thought with self-deprecation, had probably piqued Sephiroth's interest again.
Explain this to me,
Sephiroth said, gesturing at the chick that was tugging insistently at his coat.
Chocobos become attached to the first creature they see upon hatching,
Cloud explained slowly, and let his gaze focus on Viri again. Anything to avoid the cat-like green eyes that still bore into his soul.
I assume you were it for Viri. Chocobos have to stay with their parents for a while.
It was probably good that Zack was not here. He wouldn't have been able to resist addressing the issue with his new favorite term for Sephiroth.
He'll get sick if he doesn't stay with you.
Cloud brought a hand to rub at the back of his neck. The Genova buzz was giving him a headache, not something he experienced often with his Mako enhancements.
And this Chocobo views me as its parent?
Sephiroth said, a faint hint of bafflement creeping into his voice. He stared down at Viri, and the chick stared back with adoring, dark eyes. Sephiroth frowned. Viri merely cooed up at him and nibbled at the hem of his coat. Almost unbidden, Cloud found his gaze rising up to study Sephiroth's face. It took him a moment to decipher the expression on Sephiroth's face, but Cloud realized the man was actually uncertain about the little chick. Viri seemed happier than he'd ever been, and that small act of adoration had clearly disturbed Sephiroth. He found himself saying, before he stopped himself and clamped his teeth together. All Cloud had wanted to do was drop the bird off and leave, but somehow he felt he couldn't just leave things like this. For Viri's sake, at least, he'd have to somehow help Sephiroth long enough for the Chocobo to grow up.
Zack will probably help, and I can too,
he said unwillingly, letting his gaze travel off the side so he didn't have to see Sephiroth's reaction. The heavy tread of boots and a faint sigh jerked Cloud into motion. He turned sharply as Heidegger walked in.
Sephiroth,
Heidegger grumbled.
Heidegger,
Sephiroth responded flatly. Cloud backed up a few steps to get out from between the two men when it became clear they were going to ignore him. Cloud wasn't sure which was more surprising, Sephiroth's visible exasperation or the appearance of Heidegger.
What's this I hear about you taking one of my soldiers?
Heidegger's dark eyes were narrowed beneath his thick, angled brows. The head of the army looked, as Cloud remembered, large, loud, and offensive.
The papers are on your desk, then? I saw them, but I haven't signed them yet. You've never taken much interest in the regular personnel before. It's not a matter of interest, but out of necessity. We cannot have someone that may be enhanced running around unleashed. If he proves himself worthy, he would be integrated into the soldier program regardless, and thus out of your hands entirely.
Cloud was a bit affronted that they were talking about him while he was still in the room. Heidegger was doing it unknowingly, of course, since Cloud doubted the man had done more than take a cursory glance at the report on Cloud's incident. Viri had left Sephiroth's side to edge forward, tiny feathers ruffled up and beak open to hiss angrily.
I'm sure it's got nothing to do with Fair taking an interest either,
Heidegger muttered snidely. The insinuation that Sephiroth had done Zack a favor set Cloud's hackles up. The statement itself wasn't particularly condemning. In any other situation, the special treatment of a normal trooper would lead to questions. But it was Sephiroth, which right away should have told anyone that cheating the ranks was the last thing on his mind. Heidegger was a slimy bureaucrat through and through, and couldn't understand Sephiroth's complete disinterest in such petty games. Sephiroth merely stared Heidegger down for a second longer, until Heidegger turned to leave, obviously aware he was in a battle he'd already lost. Cloud remembered too late Heidegger's bad habit of taking out his frustrations on others, and only had time to take a single step forward when the man's boot raised to kick Viri. Sephiroth moved faster, and after a blur of movement, Cloud found his sword in his hand, bewildered as his brain tried to catch up with what just happened. The attack hadn't been directed at him, and the sight of Masamune buried in the carpet in front of Heidegger had Cloud bringing his sword to a less provocative position. He would have to work on the reaction of fight or die when it came to Sephiroth. Narrow green eyes landed on Heidegger, whose face had gone a pasty shade of greenish-grey. Sephiroth didn't bother to say anything, just yanked Masamune free with a metal grating sound. As Heidegger all but stumbled hastily out of the room, Cloud turned his attention back to Sephiroth. With no way to hide the sword in his hand, Cloud pretended he hadn't overreacted to the sudden attack, and that it was completely normal for him to have his weapon out. He met Sephiroth's eyes challengingly as he sheathed the blade without a word.
"You said supplies for Viri were taken care of?"
Sephiroth asked, voice perfectly calm, as if he hadn't just threatened one of Shinra's top executives.
"Yes, there's a supplier in the slums who has contacts with the Chocobo Ranch,"
Cloud said evenly.
"They won't short us. I made sure of that."
A movement at Sephiroth's feet drew his gaze down again, and Cloud could see Viri huddled against Sephiroth's boot, looking droopy in reaction to the scare he'd had. Glancing up at Sephiroth briefly, Cloud knelt on the floor, holding out a hand to the little chick. Viri perked his head up, but didn't move from Sephiroth's side. Cloud frowned, closing and opening his hand again invitingly. It took another moment, but finally Viri trotted over, accepting Cloud's caress with a disconsolate coo. Cloud straightened again, Viri in his arms, and regarded Sephiroth coolly.
"Caring for a young chocobo isn't complicated. The only issue I see is how much time Viri will demand."
Sephiroth turned his back on him and set Masamune aside as he rounded the desk.
"If your assistance is further required, I will find you,"
Sephiroth said. He sat and pulled one of the books towards himself.
"Have someone tell maintenance that the floor will require repairing."
The curt dismissal grated on Cloud's nerves. He knew he was supposed to be a simple trooper, but it was too ingrained in him to not bow to Sephiroth in any way. Despite his better judgment, Cloud found his boots moving across the floor towards Sephiroth rather than away. Without ceremony, he dumped Viri into Sephiroth's lap, ignoring the startled squawk from the bird at the abrupt movement.
"Of course, sir,"
Cloud said shortly, already turning on his heels and striding for the door.
"I'll just leave Viri to you then."
As he passed out the door, Cloud couldn't help but glance behind him through the cover of his bangs. Sephiroth looked down at the chick in his lap, a hand hesitantly raised over Viri's head, before it descended in a tentative pat. The sight disappeared behind the doorframe as Cloud's momentum carried him out of the room. His steps slowed to a stop a few feet away, the vindictive pleasure at leaving the chick in Sephiroth's care so abruptly melted away in the face of that awkward exchange. Cloud had never thought to see Sephiroth so gentle, and it squeezed his heart to see what Zack had preached so fervently. Sephiroth was just a man. The madness of Genova hadn't yet touched him. He was cold and aloof, but it was to be expected considering how he was raised and how his life had turned out. With silent steps, Cloud continued down the hallway towards the elevator. He didn't know what he'd expected of this meeting, but this twisting feeling of guilt and hope was not it. What he needed now was Zack's comforting presence. With that in mind, Cloud pressed the button to call the elevator back. While his friend probably had not returned from his duties yet, Zack's apartment was still open to Cloud. He could collect himself there and maybe figure out this enigma Sephiroth had presented. When the elevator reached the bottom floor, Cloud exited swiftly with 2 other Shinra personnel who'd shared his journey down. He kept his head down, raising a hand to acknowledge Layla's cheerful greeting as he passed through, but managed to make it outside without being stopped by the energetic woman again. When the doors slid shut behind him, Cloud straightened up, tilting his head back to stare sightlessly into the cloudy sky above. He already felt completely exhausted, and it was only mid-afternoon. Cloud wasn't used to spending so much time in close contact with people. Months of solitude and avoidance were catching up to him all at once. His promise to Tifa, to do better, to remember his friends were there to support him, weighed heavily on his mind. This probably wasn't what she meant, yet Cloud found it so much easier to rely on Zack, and even Aerith. Zack had never needed Cloud to be a hero, or a leader. All he'd ever asked of Cloud was his friendship, without ever asking Cloud to be who he wasn't. As dear as Tifa was to him, she had built up a version of Cloud as her knight in shining armor, and it hurt every time he failed to live up to her vision.
Speak of the devil and he appears before us in his poofy-haired glory,
a boisterous voice cried, making Cloud's head snap around. A group of men turned in his direction, and Cloud recognized the caller as the trooper named Sparrow. Around him were the other members of the impromptu group that had accompanied him, Zack, and Sephiroth back to Midgar. Jack was waving enthusiastically at Cloud, grinning widely and gesturing him to come closer. The hesitation was more out of confusion than anything, but after a moment, Cloud made his way over to the little group.
I see you managed to scrape most of that slime out of your hair,
Edge said in greeting, reaching out a hand to ruffle said locks. Cloud batted the hand away in annoyance, wondering where the fascination with his hair was coming from.
What did you need?
He asked quietly. Sparrow grinned at Connolly, whose shoulder he had his arm thrown over. Connolly looked uncomfortable, though Cloud wasn't sure if it was from the proximity of the other troopers or something else. He almost seemed guilty when his gaze locked on Cloud.
We found out Connolly here had some interesting gossip. We were going to head down to Loveless Avenue for some good old-fashioned recreation and relaxation,
Sparrow said smoothly.
A reunion, maybe? We only met a couple of days ago,
Gibbs grumbled, though there was a faint smile on his face.
Details,
Sparrow scoffed, brushing it away with his free hand. He released Connolly and put his hands on his hips as he regarded Cloud critically.
You,
he said, jabbing a finger into Cloud's sternum,
are going to accompany us.
Cloud raised an incredulous eyebrow at the man's audacity.
Why would I do that?
He asked levelly, batting the hand away from his chest.
Oh, come on, Cloud, it'll be fun,
Jack said, mouth still spread in a wide grin, though it dropped a bit a second later.
Unless you gotta go somewhere. We were all given leave, but no one's heard what's going on with you.
I don't have anywhere to be, but... Cloud began, shifting uncomfortably in the face of the group's unanimous desire to have him accompany them. As Gibbs had pointed out, they'd only met a few days ago. Cloud had no idea why they were so eager to continue associating with him.
Great! If our esteemed superiors would accompany us then, let's go get smashed,
Sparrow said before Cloud could muster further protests.
You underestimate the effect of Mako and alcohol,
Gibbs sighed, then gestured the group to begin walking. Sparrow gave the third a challenging smile.
What, you can't hold drink then? Now you're asking for it. I'll drink you under the table, and we'll see if you like where you wake up tomorrow,
Edge said with a rough laugh. He pounded Sparrow on the back and sent the trooper staggering a step.
That's what I'm talking about,
Sparrow crowed.
Are you doing okay, Cloud?
Connolly asked, scratching the back of his head nervously. Cloud had been swept up into their group without a chance to protest, and found himself walking between him and Jack.
Of course he is,
Jack said, nudging Cloud in the side with his elbow.
He was just as awesome as Soldier Fair and the General, after all. Hey, he did get covered in Marco,
Connolly said.
Who knows what that stuff does to a person, right?
From behind them, Gibbs' low voice said,
We do know what it can do to a person. Why do you think the soldier selection is so rigorous?
I've heard a bit about it, Connolly said, his face brightening as he seemed to come to life. He craned around to get a look at the third. What was it like? I mean, if you can say. Cloud's input wasn't apparently required as the group chatted on, leading him into the brightly lit streets. With no idea what else to do, Cloud followed, and mildly hoped that Zack wouldn't worry when he didn't turn up until late. He had the feeling they wouldn't let him go until they succumbed to their own vices. He sighed softly. At least he'd managed to get rid of Veery. He could imagine all the trouble the chick would have caused in a group of drunken soldiers.